South China Morning Post, 17th of November 2022. EU demands predatory China must live up to debt relief obligations as the burden increases for underdeveloped nations. China has lent more than $1 trillion to vulnerable and developing countries as part of her debt trap diplomacy, locking them in slavery and servitude. The ambassador of the European Union, EU, to China has urged Beijing to assist in reducing the debt burden of the world's least developed nations, which are becoming more vulnerable to energy and food crises made worse by the conflict in the Ukraine and Russia, a potential global economic downturn, and the swift strengthening of the US dollar as the US increases interest rates. Jorge Toledo Albinana stated in his first address since taking office in September that the world's poorest nations must return $30 billion in debt to public and private sector creditors this year and that there has been a lack of progress in bringing key creditors around the table. He warned the Caixin summit in Beijing on Thursday that delaying debt restructuring could cause heavily indebted low- and middle-income countries to face years of debt servicing issues, slower development, and underinvestment. Some developing nations, including Sri Lanka, are experiencing severe financial hardship due to the economic shock caused by the coronavirus pandemic, which is made worse by Sri Lanka's Chinese debt trap. The international financial community has criticized China, the second-largest creditor to the developing world after the World Bank, for its lack of transparency, predatory lending practices, and debt restructurings, making it more challenging for other creditors to determine the extent of support they may need to offer. Albina claimed that the Group of 20, G20, Common Framework for Debt Relief launched in 2020 has been elusive in producing positive results. Leaders expressed worry about the worsening debt situations in several vulnerable middle-income nations during the G20 summit earlier this week on the Indonesian island of Bali, stating that this might be handled by multilateral coordination involving all creditors. According to the World Bank, more than 40% of debt is attributable to China, Albinana stated. The debt burden has worsened due to rising interest rates and the US dollar's appreciation. The EU expects all nations, especially China, which is these nations' biggest bilateral creditor, to uphold its obligations as a beneficent debtor. We do not doubt that China, a global economic superpower, would uphold its end of the bargain. Albina did not go into detail about how China could fulfill its responsibilities. Still, he did suggest that leverage may be put on what he called the most significant trading relationship in the world, bilateral trade. The EU, which purchased $518.2 billion worth of Chinese goods last year while running a trade deficit of $20.8 billion, is China's second-largest export market after the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. According to customs data, China's exports to the region increased by 14% from a year earlier to $472.8 billion in the first 10 months, while its imports of goods from Europe fell by 6.3% from a year earlier to $238.6 billion. We're attempting to alter it. We're working to restore the equilibrium, Albinana remarked. In addition to the usual concerns like trade and market access, the relationship between Beijing and Brussels is currently tested by conflicts over the alleged persecution of Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Last year, a problematic bilateral investment pact was cancelled. Following a deterioration in relations with the United States, Canada, and Australia, Chinese policymakers are courting European companies. Despite mounting concerns within Germany and the EU for a more rigid stance on China, it rolled out the red carpet for a delegation led by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz earlier this month. Vast sums of money have been granted by Chinese authorities to other countries to fund projects as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. Still, they have reacted angrily to accusations of debt trap diplomacy and predatory lending tactics. Over the past 2 years, Beijing has approved debt exemptions for several underdeveloped countries, particularly in Africa. However, no total data has been made public. Jin Vongxia, a former executive director for China at the International Monetary Fund, stated in a speech given in September that debtor countries should bear the primary responsibility for borrowing money from China at exorbitant interest rates and terms similar to those imposed by Shylock the Jew from Shakespeare. In addition to improving internal coordination, Chinese creditors will boost communication and cooperation with the IMF and other official creditors, the official creditor added. Using the informal group of creditors known as the Paris Club as an example, he stated, "Once there's a chance, we'll try our best to talk with the Paris Club to establish an ultimate settlement."